one of the largest recipients of U.S. monetary aid. Her talk from the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. is about an hour, 30 minutes.
We are here to talk with and listen to Ayesha Siddiqa. Many of you know Ayesha because she was a visiting scholar here at the Wilson Center 3 or 4 years ago as our first Pakistan scholar. About 4 years ago, a charitable trust based in Karachi came to the Wilson Center, a trust known as the Fellowship Fund for Pakistan, and offered to help us expand our Pakistan activities here at the Wilson Center, including the inauguration of a new fellowship designed for Pakistani scholars. We have a competition every year, and as a result of this competition, we bring one scholar from Pakistan to the Wilson Center to do research and writing, and Ayesha was our first. We're now into our 4th year of this program and going great guns, thanks at least in parts to Ayesha getting us off to a very good start. Ayesha is a military analyst, a scholar, a journalist, contributes on a regular basis to several of Pakistan's leading newspapers. She holds a PhD in war studies from King's College, University of London. In addition to the book which we're going to talk about today, she is also the author of an earlier volume by the name of Pakistan's Arms Procurement and Military Buildup, 1979 to 1999. I should also say Ayesha wrote a very powerful piece for a Pakistan newspaper calling for Hala's release shortly after Hala was imprisoned. And Ayesha, you have endeared yourself to all of us for that as well. Military Ink is her new book, written in part while she was here several years ago, published earlier this year. It has been widely praised. It has been roundly condemned by some in Pakistan. Ironically, those who have denounced it most vociferously have simply succeeded in bringing more attention to the book in a way which they probably didn't intend. It has been a topic of considerable controversy, and Ayesha may touch on some of that in her remarks. Ayesha's going to talk for perhaps 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll open this for discussion with you. And we have, as you saw when you came in, copies of the book for sale when you leave here. So Ayesha, welcome back to the Wilson Center, and we turn things over to you.
Thank you, Bob, for this generous introduction. You forgot to mention that I'm also a Rolling Stone. This is indeed a great pleasure to return to the Wilson Center after so many years, and for a number of reasons. Firstly, let me begin by saying how happy I am that Hale is back. Interestingly, I was kind of going through my difficult situation at the same time as Hale was going through hers, even more tricky situation. And in that way, I can relate, at least partly to what she encountered. And I'm so happy that she's here. And I had a pleasure and honor of seeing her, working with her for a year when I was here as the Pakistan scholar. So I'm indeed very happy that she's back. I'm also very happy because this book couldn't have been written without being at the Wilson Center. Hang on a minute, I'm not talking about agencies helping me write it. I'm talking about all the scholarly input which went into producing this book. The resources that were available sitting in Washington, D.C. in the Wilson Center, not just that, the ability to be here and talk to some of the finest academics in Pakistan. in the United States, Ayesha Jalal, Wali Nasser, and others. And of course, every day interacting with Bob Hathaway, showing him, he was very kind, looking through my chapters, making suggestions. And I'm quite sure that the product that is out on the table today, probably Bob didn't expect that. Because the 1 year I was here in Washington, D.C., I was working on the theoretical portions and also trying to consolidate my framework. Much as a lot of people in Pakistan would like to believe, I find it very comical when people, very responsible people sometimes, actually suggest that the basic thesis of my book is that, 4G Foundation or Army Welfare Trust in Pakistan are actually public sector organizations, and this is incorrect. I find it very funny because if that is my main hypothesis, then there's no use writing a book. That is definitely a very limited concept. And that's not what I wanted to do. This is not what I intended to do, and this is not what I did. My stay in the Wilson Center was helpful because due to the resources I could access here, I could problematize a larger issue. And the larger issue is of military capital. My main claim is that this book is not about Pakistan. It uses Pakistan as a case study, but it's not a book about Pakistan. It's rather a book about military capital, how it's evolving all over the world, and especially its impact in a country which has authoritarian politics. And I'll come to it later, but one of the reasons that I got late in producing the book, I left United States in September 2005. I was in Pakistan for a year struggling to complete this book. And one of the reasons was that understanding the military's portion, military's economic interest, simple statement, that was perhaps the easiest part. Any organization which has access to resources, which can exploit resources, which has control over resources, would want to maintain that control. But what I could not understand at all was why other important stakeholders in Pakistan were continuously partnering with the military. And until and unless I understood that portion, I could not have completed writing this book or developing my framework. I'd revisit this point later in my presentation. But before I begin into the Pakistani section describing what I found in case of Pakistan, let me go back to my framework. And my framework is that this is about military capital, which has evolved, all over the place, all over the world. And the definition of military business, milbiz is is derived from, it's a combination of military business, refers to entrepreneurial activities not falling under this normal scope of normal accountability procedures of the state, conducted either by the military or under its implicit or explicit patronage, mainly for welfare of military fraternity. And this happens all over the world. Now, broadly speaking, there are two kinds of environments in which military capital has grown. If you look at cases in, for example, in fact, I would say broadly speaking, three categories. If you look at countries like the more developed countries like United States, France, UK, a number of others, you'd see that there is this expansion of military capital. I mean, what is Halliburton, Dynacorp, the private military enterprises? They're also part of this milbiz. What I've tried to do now, you have different forms of military capital. There is one which takes place in the more developed countries. It seems to be in control. It's done through by the private sector, but there is this collusion between the public sector, the military, and the private sector. And its evolution has really depended on the manner in which the security sector has evolved and expanded. I mean, this is really the crisis of lack of an intellectual discourse or limitation of the intellectual discourse on what is the security sector like, especially after the end of Cold War. We have not systematically conceptualized it, and what I'm saying is that military capital has grown. The security sector is not just limited to the military, it includes the entire military fraternity. When you look at the stakeholders who benefit from it, and the one term which I've used constantly in my book is military fraternity, which includes serving members, retired members of the armed forces, and civilian beneficiaries of military business complex. A second category is what you find in more controlled economies like China, Cuba, Iran, etc. And there, the military has either been traditionally part of the economy or has been involved much more deeply in economic functions. And then thirdly, you have another category which pertains to cases like Pakistan, where military has expanded its economic function or economic control due to its political power. So whatever way you look at it, military capital all over the world has increased. When I looked at existing literature, there are works on private military enterprises, on private security. There were a few works on China, lesser number of works on Latin America, where this kind of military capital, which I find is illegal, is pervasive. Very few works there, and a few studies in Indonesia. Now, for me, there were really two things which I wanted to do with my work, with my study. Firstly was connect the dots, understand what this military capital does. How does it interact with politics? How does it have an effect on politics, on policy making, on socio-economic and socio-political development in any given country? And the second thing which I wanted to do was look at how does it impact in an authoritarian state. Because one of my conclusions is that this military capital, especially when it takes place, and irrespective of wherever it takes place, and particularly in an authoritarian structure, is a byproduct of military's political power. Militaries operate, militaries have capitalist interests, militaries have an economy all over the world. But the variation in the kind of model that we have, the variation in the kind of exploitation we have, or the power of exploitation is proportional to the political power that an organization has. And so for me, it was interesting to study Pakistan, where the military is a politically powerful player. And so let me also share this thing with you that unlike contrary to what a lot of people in Pakistan would like to believe, and I'm sure they've not read the book when they make such a claim. I've not suggested for a minute that the military is in politics because of its economic interests. What in fact I have suggested is, what in fact my conclusions are, is that the military is in economy because of its political power. And that this economic power is a spin-off of its political power, but also substantiates that political power. It enhances that political power. And therefore, once you have a combination of strength, economic and political power, the military would not want to withdraw from that position. So for any observer, for any student of Pakistan, it is very important to understand the length and breadth and also the depth of the power of this one institution, the armed forces. Very quickly, these are my 6 models. My basic thesis, or my basic framework is that there's a politically strong state, and around that are 6 concentric circles. And as you move away from this politically strong state, as the politically strong state weakens, military's control and its exploitation increases. Not just exploitation, but also direct exploitation increases. So these are just that. Let me quickly move to Pakistani military's political and economic power. It is, as I mentioned, it's a very powerful institution. And it's very interesting to hear all the debate in the United States about Pakistani politics. And I wouldn't blame anyone who then concludes that, yes, military is the right actor to deal with because it is so powerful. That is, of course, one of the conclusions. As people also say that military, the issue is in Pakistani politics is the military is part of the problem, but it's also part of the solution. What I've tried to understand, and in that respect, it is a work in progress. I've looked at the available evidence. And let me say it's not a conclusive evidence. I mean, conclusive to the point that I do not have a quantitative framework. My framework, the framework in my book is essentially qualitative framework. What I've tried to do is basically to draw the animal, draw the picture of the animal, of a politically powerful military. And I've looked at the aspects which have not been understood or looked into before. And that aspect pertains to its economic strength, which is not limited to the defense budget, which is in fact much greater. Once we look at military's economic strength, we are looking at its overall exploitation of resources. Currently, if you look at the defense budget, and again, defense budget is underreported. There are billions and billions of rupees which are not even part of the defense budget. The pensions have been, since General Musharraf came into power, 30 to 35 billion rupees of pensions have been taken away, put under civilian head, so they no longer even show up in the defense budget. These are cosmetic changes which have been done. Another 60 to 70 billion is not even reported. So there is, there is a huge chunk from the defense budget, from the national budget, which doesn't even get reported. Now, if you include that, then you're looking at 2.5% to 3% of the GNP. These are the reported figures. But what I'm suggesting here is that this economy, military's economic strength is much larger. And if you start looking at all the resources they claim, we are looking at something over 6% of the GNP. Now, military's economic presence is at 3 levels. First is what I call the institutional level, where they're involved in both formally and informally, visibly and less visibly. Then there is the second level, which is the level of the subsidiaries. These are the 5 welfare foundations. I've mentioned over just 4. By the time I was finishing the manuscript, they had set up a 5th foundation, and I really can't wait, to make a list of all what they do. They continue to expand. And the third level is where individual members then exploit the power of the military institution or their association with this powerful institution to exploit resources. And there is an interconnection between the 3. And they operate in the formal economy, the informal economy, they're also in the illegal economy. Now, let's talk about the first level, which is where they have an organizational presence. They are what I call cooperatives or small and medium enterprises. They are anything. Now, this 136 million is what they say, what they claim is what they earn annually from these ventures, and they run into hundreds. They're bakeries, they're gas stations. In some cases, they've also cores have put taxation, imposed taxation on highways. It's not the case any longer. They have commercial markets. There is extortion from fishermen in the coastal belt. And by the way, this includes both military and paramilitary. There is, of course, coercive use of state land. It's state land which is then converted for commercial use. And this I call coercive use of state land. Now, this is the difficult part of the military economy. It is not quantifiable because it's not visible, it's not transparent. One would love to have complete data of what they earn, and a complete data of what is actually the value of the assets, of the state assets, which go into these kind of operations. Anybody familiar with Pakistan or anybody familiar with who visits Pakistan I'm sure would know Shara Faisal Avenue at Karachi. It's a long road which runs from Karachi airport to the city. And of course, you drive through, drive on a road with military installations and military cantonments on both sides. Now, the interesting part is that wherever you have cantonment and wherever you have the cantonment, the billboards that go up on the roads, their contracts are also sometimes given. In fact, in this particular case, is given out by senior officers. They do not necessarily understand the business. They do not have the marketing sense of what are billboards worth. So once they claim that they earn 136 million rupees from these small and medium enterprises, it does not necessarily mean that they have quoted the actual value or they understand what is the worth, the exact worth of the business. Then you have military's public sector organizations like the NLC, the FWO, and a third which I've mentioned is the Special Communication Organization. NLC today is a major transportation giant, and FWO, Frontier Works Organization, is into construction. A recent report which was published in Dawn, apparently some data provided by ISPR, which is spokesperson, or the agency, the the spokespeople for the military, according to their data, the worth of FWO's assets are 141 billion rupees. Unfortunately, they've not provided similar data for National Logistics Cell, where they claim that the annual turnover is 6 billion rupees. Of course, this concept of turnover does not give any picture at all. It doesn't explain anything. Does it really explain the liabilities of the organization? Do they explain the way projects are subsidized? It does not give anybody a sense. And the problem here is with the NLC and the FWO is that there is evidence of interference and distortion. And one of the clearest examples of that was a recent case of the northern bypass in Karachi. The contract was given to NLC without open bidding. And what is even stranger is that once the bridge collapsed, killing 5 to 7 people and injuring about 27, the task of cleaning up was given to Frontier Works Organization. So it's very interesting the way they manage these things. Let me quickly also make another point. Once you talk to people in Pakistan, one of the arguments is that, look, these organizations, the military does not interfere in business. It does not create monopolies. So what's wrong if they do it? Of course it doesn't create monopolies. And I've not suggested anywhere in my book that it's creating monopolies. But what I'm saying in my book is that it is monopolizing resources along with the rest of the ruling elite and along with its other cronies, which in most cases are civilian stakeholders. In fact, important civilian stakeholders. This military economy is important to understand because it is also reflective of the political structure of Pakistan. The linkages are cross-cutting. They're both vertical and horizontal. It's not military exploiting resources on its own. It has its powerful cronies in the civil society as well. But we'll come to that later. Then you have the the mid-level, which is the level of subsidiaries. There are 5 foundations. The first is the 4G Foundation, which runs 24 projects. And as you look at the list, they're into oil and gas, they're into cement, they're into education, they produce cereals, they produce sugar, they're into information technology, they're into the power sector. And that reminds me something very interesting, but I'll leave that for later. That today, when you look at the power sector, for example, there are 13 companies in Pakistan, 13 powerhouses in Pakistan, electricity, out of which 9 are being directly managed by military personnel. I mean, when I say directly, it means that they've got military personnel mostly retired in both mid and senior management levels. So you can look at their involvement, how pervasive is their involvement. Then you have the second foundation. The 4G Foundation was started with the War Veterans Fund in 1954. It's a tri-service organization. Very interestingly, another organization was then set up in October of 1971, Army Welfare Trust, which at this moment runs 41 projects. They're into agriculture, they're into cement, they're into fertilizer production, they're heavily into finance as well. They have an Askari bank, they're into insurance, private security, electricity generation, aviation, and of course they've got interest in real estate as well. Then the Air Force decided to open its foundation in 1977. And let me remind you that the expansion of the military economy went parallel with the expansion of military's political power. The only time when the military economy did not really expand was during the 1970s, under Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. But perhaps, there is no conclusive evidence, but perhaps Bhutto understood that military's economic autonomy, financial autonomy would add to its political autonomy. In all other periods, wherever they have been powerful, military has expanded its financial interests. So in 1977, soon after the second military government of General Ziaul Haq came in, the Shaheen Foundation was set up. And it has 11 projects. They used to have an international airline, which was then closed down about 2-3 years ago, and they were heavily in debt. But they're into airport services, they're into air cargo, they have a paid TV, they're into radio and insurance as well. Then finally you had Bahria Foundation, which wouldn't be left behind. This is the Navy, and it runs 23 projects. They're into, of course, fishing, farming, they have a bakery, they're into university, construction, etc. And what I've not mentioned is the Pakistan Ordnance Factories, which has come up with its own foundation. So it's very interesting. I mean, welfare, of course, is important. But what is even more interesting is they use welfare as an excuse to keep expanding their economic interests. Then finally, the third level is the individuals. And here, you have the more quantifiable and the less quantifiable parts of the economy. There is, of course, land, which is both urban and rural, which is given to the military. Within the public sector, you have over 1,000 jobs given to both retired and serving military. Then, they control major corporations and departments. I mean, today, any important organization in Pakistan you visit would have either retired or a serving military officer there. They have a share in the civil service. Now, we are made to believe that this was a constitutional provision. There's a constitutional provision to give the military 10% share in the civil service. There is nothing of that. This kind of a concept is not real at all, in fact. The 10% share was accorded to the military under General Zia's rule. They were given this understanding that they would get 10% of the jobs in the civil service. Therefore, that's how they claim their share. Then you have individual officers which operate outside the legal framework. And what I mean by this is that their connection with the armed forces, their parent organization, is essential in exploiting opportunities outside. The senior generals, I mean, let's go back to the days of General Ayub Khan, 1950s. When General Ayub Khan, when this military economy had started in 1950s, the basic assumption was that it was being done as a contribution to economic development. But then soon after, it kind of diverted into something else. It turned towards predation. General Ayub Khan used his influence to benefit his own family, and other senior generals benefited their own families as well. Now, should we just take it as a coincidence? Is it just, a couple of stories? Is it just a general, not thinking about the institution, not thinking or being too obsessed with his personal interest? And I challenge that assumption. What I'm saying is that when you have that kind of political power and when you have that lack of accountability, and when you have a political strength which is extremely unaccountable, then it will turn towards predation. Predation, in fact, is, ultimately, where it will all end. If you look at historically, since the 1950s, you have important generals whose families have then made wonderful financial careers. Is it just a coincidence that they, that they were military personnel? I'm sure, I'm not debating it, that some of them would have, wonderful financial commercial acumen. But it's more than just that. Military's central position in the state of Pakistan tells more than half of the story of their, of their commercial acumen, of their successes. And that linkages are important to understand. Of course, the military defends their commercial empire. And one of their arguments is that it provides welfare. Do it for welfare. It feeds 9% of the total population, 160 million people. It contributes taxes. There are wonderful figures, which some of them I can quote. They say we create these businesses are meant to create jobs for both retired and military and both retired military personnel and civilian. It's a method for reintegrating military personnel into civilian life. It does not result in exploitation, and more important, has no impact on the military. One of the things which one of my claims in the book is that it has an impact. In fact, it has an indirect, both direct and indirect impact on military's professional capabilities. And very early on in their careers, especially when you are when an officer is in the fast track, there is always the possibility of these personnel getting diverted by the future possibilities. And so you begin to compromise. You begin to compromise on professionalism. Very interestingly, I was asked when I had my first launch in London in June, on 11th of June this year. There was somebody from the High Commission, and they said, "You have given no data to elaborate how military professionalism gets affected by their indirect economic interests." And my answer to her was that, look, how do I define professionalism? Is it on the basis of the number of wars they've won for me, or is it that they march in straight line? So professionalism gets affected by how a military conducts itself, at least strategically, if not tactically. There are other situations like in Iran, the Pasdaran, where the impact is much more tactical. Here, the impact is much more strategic. And of course, what they argue is that there is no financial burden. Let me just quickly look at all these 3 points. I'm not challenging in my book at all that it does not contribute towards welfare. But the issue that needs to be understood is that what is the cost of this welfare? the military economy which has grown in Pakistan in particular, and it denotes indirect subsidies by the state of Pakistan, by the government. Sometimes hidden subsidies, sometimes extremely hidden subsidies, which make quantification of this capital, of this economy, very difficult. And so for a citizen, it becomes very difficult to quantify, to calculate the defense, the total defense, the defense burden. Secondly, what I've also tried to do is use some of the military's own data, some of the data from some of these companies, to determine their efficiency. And the evidence that I have come up with suggests, I mean, I'm looking at, for example, 5 years of balance sheet of Army Welfare Trust. And what I've learned from that evidence is, in fact, that their claim, or the claim that these organizations are highly efficient is, in fact, highly questionable. Now, any company would become inefficient or efficient. But the problem here is that these companies, the efficiency or lack of the inefficiency of these companies create a cost which is then pushed on to the rest of the economy, which is imposed on the rest of the economy. It's imposed on the taxpayers. So this economy is extremely problematic, but more so due to its opportunity cost. In fact, that is the more interesting part of the costs that occur due to this economy. And these costs are, number one, it enhances the military's control of the state and the society. I mean, today the military is far more visible. It has enhanced in terms of its visibility in the society and in the economy. Its visibility in the society has expanded because of the expansion of its economic interests. And that it has managed to do, of course, due to its political strength. Secondly, it creates cronyism. I mean, I'm sure that most of you who are here are interested in Pakistan, are Pakistanis or are interested in Pakistan. And today's Pakistan draws attention, a lot of attention. There are people who want to find out, who are interested to know what is going to happen to this country's future. And what I'm proposing to do here is to understand two things. One, what is the overall strength of the most powerful institution of the state? And secondly, what kind of network of relationships govern the interest of the organization and of its cronies? And this military economy that I talk about and explain in my book is very central to the predatory relationship between different stakeholders in Pakistan. The military economy that I described today is, any analysis of it would be incomplete without looking at the economic empires or the mini empires of other stakeholders. I mean, this is an economy which brings a lot of stakeholders together. It brings all the Chaudhry Shujaat Hussain and the Shaukat Aziz and the Benazir Bhuttos and the Nawaz Sharifs and the General Musharrafs and other generals all together. And to explain that, I've gone back to the political philosophy of Pakistan's most prominent, in fact, one of the most prominent political scientists, Hamza Alavi. Because as I mentioned earlier, in the beginning of my talk, is that I delayed this book. The book got delayed by a year, at least, because I couldn't understand these linkages. And not until I had gone back to Hamza Alvi did I begin to understand that how deeply all of these are connected. The ruling elite in Pakistan is connected. And this military capital is in fact one of the many elements which denote their networking. I'm not saying that it causes that networking. At some level it does. But what I'm saying it is essentially, it denotes the impact of that networking. It brings them together. In order to have, to put it very simply, in order to get resources itself, in order to acquire resources itself, the military then distribute it to its other cronies too. And there is evidence, there's unending evidence to suggest how this kind of illegal capital, and by the way, this kind of capital, which is not, because of lack of accountability, I call it illegal. And this kind of illegality is inherent in the nature of, in the character of this kind of military capital, irrespective of where you find it in the world. But more so in an authoritarian political system, where it is used then to build connections and interrelationships and interlinkages with other partners. And the problem is that if one wants to understand today's Pakistan or think of or conceptualize solutions to the problems of today's Pakistan, then one has to understand the nature of this capital and the nature of the politics which revolves around this capital. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ayesha. We'll now give folks in the audience a chance to weigh in and ask questions. I would ask you to wait until we can get a microphone for you. We're crowded in here, which I think suggests there's a lot of interest in the topic, in the book. So wait till we get the microphone to you, and if you will, identify yourself and keep your question or your comment quite brief, if you will. The light's right in my eyes, so I'm going to try to find people in the back of the room as well as the front of the room. But I will, Hala, we're going to go with you first, and then we'll go down here. Hala.
Thank you. I'm Hala Svandiari from the Middle East program. Ayesha, how are the CEO of these companies chosen? Are they only among the military, or once they start these companies, they go and look for civilians? Is that also a network among people who know each other and who have been working with each other?
Well, Hale, see, the companies, the subsidiaries, of course, have the top management is military. People who work down below are a combination of civilian and retired military. At the top, their claim, in fact, is that we are efficient because although we have military management, but we use civilian experts. The problem here is that the final decision-making does rest with military personnel. And the issue here is, do they have a corporate sense? They claim, what I found interesting was, in fact, I'll tell you that what I found very interesting was what I managed to learn through my interviews about the character of this military, the evolving character of this military. Its officers today are much more confident than what they were 20 years ago. This is a much more confident officer cadre. For example, when you'd question them about, can you run corporate, are you trained to run corporate operations? And they would turn around in most cases and would say, well, we can run the country, why can't we run businesses? Or, some of them would say, well, look at Eisenhower, look at Charles de Gaulle, look at Ronald Reagan. These were people with, some military career, and if they can run their countries, why can't we? And that kind of confidence, for me, is what is a spin-off of years of political control. And so, while they say that there is a system of merit through which people are selected, but you have so many officers which retire every year, but a lot really depends on who do you know, and if you are in favor with the top management.
Yes, my name is Shahid. I am a Pakistani diplomat. I agree there must be a lot of mistakes in the Pakistan army, and they must have done a lot of wrong things. But let's start by comparing certain things between America and Pakistan, both the armies. So first of all, I talk about the earthquake which happened in Pakistan in the recent past. There was a very big hospital in Azad Kashmir, which totally collapsed. Something like 350 patients died, and 33 or some hospital doctors died, and all that. I would like to know Ayesha Siddiqa, or I would like she should tell the people which was this hospital, who was paying for the money for this thing, from where the medicines were coming, why the doctors were on deputation there, why all they died. And second thing is that will she like to compare Katrina with the earthquake? Once FWO and NLC cleared all the roads in the top mountains of the world in 4 or 5 days, and everything was flowing and going through all those things. So I would like to know, again, all these things are all welfare organizations. I want to correct one thing more also. These welfare organizations are providing a lot of facilities to the people in Azad Kashmir and all remote areas of Pakistan. And this is no public money, and this is nobody's money. This is the money which is coming from the pocket of the army soldiers, those who are serving. And officers are not getting benefited, only the soldiers and the poor people and the widows and their families are getting these things and all benefited. If there's any doubt, I would like Ayesha to deny this thing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Right. Shahid Saab, I've not suggested, I can see that you're clearly upset, like a good Pakistani diplomat. But what I've not suggested for a minute that these organizations do not do work or they do not do welfare. What I'm suggesting, in fact, is that beyond a certain point, the costs of commercial activities become uncontrollable and have an impact. You see, if I'm doing something, I have to do cost calculation. And cost is not just the financial cost, it's also the opportunity cost. And like a good Pakistani, the first thing my first response to you is that, look, the greatest opportunity cost of these economic ventures is that it has an impact on the reputation of the armed forces. And one does not want that. FWO was started in 1966 to build the Silk Road, connecting Pakistan with China. Now, once it finished, instead of it being merged, being dissolved, it was then, kept there and later engaged in commercial activities. And as I mentioned, that there is now evidence that there are occasions on which they get contracts without open bidding. The other thing is that military organizations all over the world perform certain functions. It's part of the duty constitutionally of any military in the world. Show me one military which does not have as its duty, the task of assisting civilian authorities in natural disasters and civilian emergencies. So why should we imagine that our military will not do it? And why should we expect that once it does it, we should be appreciating it, praising it, extraordinarily. It's an institution which does its job and, and move on. Katerina, of course, Katerina, again, I'm not looking at who is better than the other. If you would take time to probably read my book, you'll see. It's not, I have compared, but there is no black and white. Every country has to find its own, has to find its own tipping point. I mean, look at United States. I've said much more than comparing Katrina with earthquake in Kashmir. And if you look at, for example, United States, you will see that the manner in which the security sector has expanded here and the manner in which, for example, the private military establishments have been engaged in war zones in different parts would have a direct impact on how policies are made. And what I'm suggesting here is that if you allow the military to expand its economic interest anywhere in the world, then you are looking at a problem. And it's not an issue here of saying this organization is good or that organization is bad. And I'd really like you to appreciate that.
Yeah, Ms. Siddiqa, my name is Kami Bhatt and I work for Pakistan Chronicle, and my question is about, let's assume for a second that Pakistani army and politicians both are corrupt. But what is the difference between, in terms of that corrupt money being invested, the politician who steal money and then send abroad in Switzerland, in America, or Middle East, the military who stole money and then invest in Pakistan and provide jobs to thousands or millions of people? And I could give you another example, for example. When Musharraf took over, he wanted to talk with Chaudhry Shujat, and Chaudhry Shujat declined that request. And then Musharraf ordered to open his file, his corruption. And this guy went there and literally touched his feet, General Musharraf's feet, because he didn't want to, get exposed. And same thing, there was Richard Boucher a few months ago in a hotel, and I saw there were 5 or 6 Pakistani. They all behave like slaves. And there was only one Pakistani man, lawyer, who showed some dignity and kept his self-respect. And he told us that Benazir Bhutto copied and wrote comment with her pen about it, taking an undercut that he faxed to Switzerland, and she didn't get his part. And that papers has been caught by General Musharraf for his spells, and she is afraid of getting exposed. And this is the reason she is willing to do anything to form an alliance. Now you tell me, these politicians, Benazir Bhutto and Chaudhry Shujat, are they forming alliance with military because they want to serve Pakistani, or they are just fearful that they would be exposed as a thief? Thanks.
Well, probably Prime Minister Shaukat Aziz might give you a better answer than me, who has been a keeper of all the slush funds for many in the world.
But it's raised question about your intention. What are your motivation? Why don't you? To me, I'm an economist. So compared to military, if it, let me say, it stole 50 billion, but if it provide job to 1 million people, that's lots less serious sin and crime than the politician who stole, let's say, $500 million and they send abroad. It's not useful to any Pakistani. So you are economist, you are not, you are a smart person. You tell me, why don't you go after politician?
Again, you see, my suggestion is please read the book. Not as a general would read it, but as an economist would read it. And this is not a question of what is, one good or one bad. There is no black and white, right? What I'm suggesting here, you've talked about the corruption of politicians. Now, firstly, there is no evidence to suggest that military personnel are completely clean. When you refer to National Accountability Bureau opening files of politicians, but let me tell you that once they tried to open files for military generals and they were stopped. Let me quote 2 incidents. One was when General Amjad, a very very honest officer, was heading National Accountability Bureau. When he started to look into not just the corporate sector, the corrupt corporate sector, but also some of the corrupt senior military officers, and there's a whole list of them, he was packed off. Recently, I mean, the reports are that General Shahid Aziz, again, wanted to investigate a few deals and was packed off. They're corrupt generals and they're corrupt politicians, they're honest politicians and they're honest generals as well. It's not that issue at all. It's not the issue of who's creating what. The issue is much larger. If you allow a professional military to expand itself, to expand its power, ultimately it's going to be bad for the country's politics and for its economy and society. Look what has happened in 60 years. It's not just, I'll tell you, one of the reasons that, for example, people didn't come out on the streets this time when Nawaz Sharif tried to re-enter the country. I mean, we didn't have access to images of people protesting and people and blockades that were erected for his followers. But more than that, I think one of the reasons that people didn't, you didn't have millions and millions out on the streets is because the political process is dying in Pakistan. That's the most tragic thing that can happen to that country. And that tragedy is part of expansion of civil military authoritarianism. It will be incorrect for either you or me to imagine that the power of and corruption, both the power and corruption of Musharraf is different or is not related with the power and corruption of Benazir or Nawaz Sharif or Chaudhry Shujaat or Parvez Ilahi. They're all interconnected. And we need to not look at the problem, at the issue in black and white comparisons, but look at a more complex picture.
Tazy Schaefer.
Ayesha, lovely to see you back here. I have two questions, and my basic question is, I don't know whether you've covered these things in your book. If you have, I'd appreciate your thoughts. The first has to do with the conditions for doing business among the institutions that are owned either by the military or by retired military organizations. Is there a level playing field? Are the prices they pay for things like land comparable? Is access to licenses and so on also comparable? And the second question has to do with the impact on the way the senior officer corps looks at the question of Pakistan's security. Did you explore this, and if so, were you able to observe whether the relative importance of economic issues, the health of Pakistan's economy, has changed in the way senior officers think about Pakistan's security? Is Pakistan's economic health now looked on in the army as a security issue, or is it still something that's secondary to Pakistan's difficult relations with India?
Desi, I'll start with the second one. Of course, economy or a healthy economy has always been one of the important issues for the military, for the senior military officers. In fact, that way, military has direct stakes in a functioning, healthier economy, because toys for boys cannot be bought unless the economy performs, unless the macroeconomic indicators at least are good. So of course that way they think about it. But then, see, the Pakistani military officer, especially at the top level, is a very interesting crossbreed between a professional and a professional in a predatory predatory stroke Praetorian military. They do not. I mean, when they think about their career, when they think about issues, they look at you know at more military professional issues. So you would not see them thinking deeply about economic issues. I mean, economy is there; it's important. You need to have it. It needs to strengthen. It's something that ought to happen. But to have good economy, you do not necessarily have to have wonderful relations with India. And you do not necessarily have to have normal politics. Relations with India, for example, will improve, not because they logically think, or their logic is determined by issues of financial efficiency or inefficiency. In fact, one of my conclusions is that their operations are not as efficient as they claim them to be. Relations with India will change on the basis of how they problematize the security situation in the region. For example, if you look at the Kashmir issue will get solved not because of how serious they are about Pakistan's improvement of Pakistan's macroeconomic indicators, but mainly because they understand today that India and Pakistan cannot battle each other on existential issues. Kashmir is an existential issue which can bring the two countries on the brink of war and conflict much more easily. And war and conflict in a nuclear South Asia is not fun and games. So their conception of the region, their perception of other regions, their perception of global politics is not really based on an economic logic, but more on their perception of security, of geostrategy. How are these businesses operated? Do they have level playing field, etc.? 1993, politicians are remembered for all the bad things. And it somehow happens that some of the good things that they do get completely lost in the lot of bad that they do. Similarly, we forget that in 1993, this was under Nawaz Sharif's first government. All welfare foundations were asked to pay taxes. They were asked to pay taxes, same amount of taxes. Well, there was some variation. I mean, for a long time, Army Welfare Trust was paying less than Behriya and Shaheen, and much less than Fauji Foundation. So that way, they all pay taxes. But then there are variations. There are some segments of their businesses which do not pay taxes. So there are different patterns, there are different kind of traditions there. As I said earlier, they do not create monopolies. And there are two reasons for it. Firstly, they do not create, there is no evidence that military tends to create monopolies. There are businesses, there are contracts on which they would allow others to play, and therefore, you'd say you can almost suggest that there is an element of free bidding here, and there are times when they actually go and get those contracts. So there is no pattern there. There's some where it will happen. There's some where it won't happen. In real estate, for example, they have kind of twisted, they have far more advantages they've created far more advantages for themselves. They use their political clout. There are times when they use coercion. There are cases after cases, legal cases pending in different courts of law in which land was both private and public land was acquired and utilized, and then disposed of using the power of the organization. But there is no fixed pattern there. And there are two explanations for it. Firstly is, they want to create an impression. Secondly, I believe that it's because there is no consensus on the organization on what is their primary role. They are deep into the economy, yet they're going through a period right now in which they have not really problematized and thought about their role, or about institutionalizing this economic role much more intensely than what they're doing right now. I mean, I'll explain what I mean by institutionalizing the economic role. I mean, for example, in the Indonesian military, you have cadres which are involved in political functioning, in economic planning, farming, etc., etc. Here, you do not have that kind of an issue. But it does not mean that they do not have an economic role, and that's what I'm saying, that they've not managed to problematize it. Thirdly, I think one of the reasons that military economy operates in a gray area as far as the organizational thinking goes is because of the nature of the military organization itself. I mean, if you were to read my book, you'll see that my model, my framework talks about 6 models of civil-military relations. And each of them are connected with a certain kind of economy. Pakistan, Turkey, and Indonesia belong to a category which are called the parent-guardian military, which means that these are the militaries which create partnerships with civilian stakeholders and politicians through legal and constitutional methods. And therefore, they cannot really create complete monopolies. There has to be a monopolization of resources. What then happens is that there will be instances in which they will exploit resources much more intensely than their civilian competitors. And there are instances in which they'll allow others to exploit. So that framework needs to be understood.
Question over here.
Thank you. I am Naeem Salik from Science Johns Hopkins. Ayesha, you have done a lot of hard work in putting together this book, but I have a few observations, mainly based on your presentation which you have made right now. It appears to me that you have taken the military out of the Pakistani socio-economic complex, put it separately on a tabletop and analyze it as an entity which is not operating with the other socio-economic complexities of Pakistan. The second thing is that the impression one gets from your presentation is that anybody who chooses to wear the uniform abdicates his right to citizenship of the country. You have talked a lot of exploitation by the military resources and welfare organizations and jobs to the military people. You should have also explained at what age the military people retire. A soldier retires at the age of 35. An officer retires at the age of 70 to 80% officers retire at the age of between 40 to 43. And about another 20% retire at the age of between 45 and 50. And it's only 1 or 2% which serve up to the age of 50. So if people retire in the 40s, having given their best years to the service of the nation, Do you think that they do not have any right to jobs or their economic benefit? They have to look after their families. And where do they go? Should they be thrown out in the Arabian Sea? Where should they go? They have to find employment. That is why these employments, these welfare organizations are there. Second thing which you have not pointed out, you talked of a lot of senior generals heading these organizations. Retired generals are appointed at the head of this organization, but there is a contract for 3 years. That's the maximum everybody gets. Not more than that. There are no people perpetually heading these organizations. Look at the Askari Bank. You said the people are not managing and this. Do you see any military person sitting, serving or retired in the Askari Bank? It is one of the best performing banks in Pakistan. And whenever I go there, I see all youngsters, MBA qualified from the universities, fresh graduates running that enterprise. There are no military people. So I think whereas you may be right in some of your observations and criticism, but I think you have been drawing too simplistic and naive conclusions from whatever you have studied. For instance, you talked about pensions which are not included in the defense budget anymore. Yes, it's the same in India also at this, right now. But this is the figure which is known, that this is the amount of pensions which is being paid from non-defense heads. But you talked of 60 to 60 billion rupees in defense budget which are not reported. Where does this money come from? How did you find that figure of 60 to 65 billion if it is not reported? Where it is spent? And I would like you to explain a little bit on that. And then you talked about the compromise.
This will be your last question.
Last point. About military officers compromising on their careers because they see future possibilities. Do you think, what kind, I fail to understand this point. Does it mean that people start working extra hard to become generals so that once they retire, they head all these organizations? Or they stop working at that time and what do they do? How does it compromise the professionalism of future possibilities of heading these some of these enterprises?
Naim Saab, all excellent questions. And I must admit, I made a pathetic presentation. Because had it been good, it would have answered a lot of your questions. Of course, I'm not looking at military separately from the civil society. Completely confess that I made a poor presentation. If you were to read my book instead, you'll find that I have made those linkages. Do military officers then abdicate their right to become citizens? Of course not. Not for a minute have I suggested anywhere. This is an interesting argument that, the bulk of the military officers retire at 35 and therefore they have a right to, resources. This is a claim which incidentally General Musharraf also makes, and I'm sure all good military officers make that claim. And I have no problem with it. See, but look at the issue, the linkage of how then economic exploitation happens. 1980s was the first time when, this was under Ziaul Haq, that military officers, the whole practice of giving urban land to military officers started. And if you'd go back whenever you return to Pakistan next, please go and check. At least I have access to the document, which you'll find in the GHQ. This was an undertaking which every military officer had to give to the service headquarters. And according to this undertaking, this was an undertaking that they have no urban property in their own name or in the name of their spouse or their family. And then, urban property was given to them, right? Now, if you start looking at the condition of officers today, you have a number of officers who have 7 to 8 properties. Now, where do we have to draw a line on welfare somewhere. You look at some other professional militaries, and you'll see that everywhere in the world, militaries the bulk of military officers retire at an early age. But then it's an issue of deciding what kind of economic model we want to follow. These are indirect subsidies. I'm not suggesting that we should not do enough for the welfare of our NCOs, JCOs, and officers. What I'm suggesting is that these are indirect subsidies. I mean, for example, there is state land. The manner in which state land has been used and abused is very interesting. The British, the military land and cantonment manual is very specific on the categorization of land in a military cantonment and how it's supposed to be used. Because military cantonment in Pakistan is a legacy of the British. And the manuals which the British then left are very, very specific and detailed about how the land is to be used. Now, in this case, I grew up in Lahore cantonment and I saw the lands which used to be infantry, meant for the exercises of infantry as firing ranges, then turning into housing schemes and sold out. Now, this is state land. Why should... Now, here are two issues. Firstly, a powerful institution using its power and influence in the overall state mechanism uses that power and influence to capitalize and utilize those resources. And the second question is, why should a single institution then have that monopoly over use of state resources? Now, perhaps when we have a little more normal politics, a good political government might want to negotiate these spaces with the military. For instance, could we replace indirect subsidies with direct subsidies? Officers, and I'm not saying that all are corrupt officers, they're good officers as well. Perhaps it would be nice if they are given direct subsidies, some resources, a certain amount of resources, and the state then uses its land, it perhaps sells it, privatizes it itself, and uses the resources, what it draws from the sale, not only to provide these direct subsidies to these officers, but also spends it on development and on, other areas as well. So that we need to decide. I have no problem with spending on the military, but how we spend it, I'm just asking questions on how we are spending it and whether this is, really the correct way of doing it. Askari Bank, if you look at the board of Askari, which manages Askari, all decisions are taken at the top and they're all senior officers there. They're assisted by civilian experts, the real bankers. The bankers are civilians. That is not the issue. But you see, where you have decision making has to be done by people from that field. And in fact, let me draw my attention towards a number of towards the correspondence which has on several occasions gone on between the Securities Exchange Commission of Pakistan and the Army Welfare Trust and Fauji Foundation. On several occasions, the SECP has demanded that these organizations replace the military officers with civilian experts or qualified people, because according to the rules and regulations, people sitting at specific positions have to be qualified to do that job. And in these instances, these were not people qualified to do these jobs. Yet, not only in those several cases, the SECP, the Securities and Exchange Commission of Pakistan, was snubbed. their instructions were not followed at all. So these issues are being raised, and of course, you look at more sitting at size, you look at strategic issues. Of course, you don't probably deal with the interaction between the commercial enterprises and other state institutions. But if you go back and start looking at the correspondence, you'd see that there are problems. ASCRI, of course, is supposedly a well-performing bank, yet there are experts in the banking sector, who have issues with the way it's run. Its strategy is very conservative. Right now, if you look at Pakistan's economy, ASCRI, like many other banks, is also beneficiary of the spin-off of that strategy. And one would have problems with that strategy of how Pakistani economy is being run in the first place. So they're, in complex yet interrelated issues. And what I'm trying to do is not point a finger at the military here. I'm trying to understand what military capital and the expansion of military capital does in an authoritarian polity. And that is the only reason why I have looked at Pakistan. Professionalism. See, what I'm suggesting here is that once military becomes critical to redistribution of resources, and the evidence becomes apparent to the officers, to the members of this organization, it has an impact on the professional capacity. Once you are in the rank, once you're in the promotional fast track, the issue then becomes, it's not that you don't do your work. I'm not even suggesting that officers serve in these organizations beyond a contractual period. Of course, they're there for a contract. But these jobs are allocated to them not just on the basis of merit. It's allocated to them on how good they are with the senior management. Now that generates cronyism in an organization and would have an impact on their professional behavior. This is a rule of the thumb anywhere in the world. You apply it on any organization, we would have the same result. As an example, let me just remind you of the fate of General Mahmood. General Mahmood fell out of favor, and then later, when he kind of begged for forgiveness and went and asked for opportunities, he did get a position as Director General of 4G Fertilizer. So this is the top management of the armed forces has this advantage of giving these jobs in these organizations to people they want to favor, and sometimes people they don't want to favor. It works both ways. So there's no strictly principle of merit that is followed, and that is very critical, and we need to look into that.
Ayesha, I want to end this on a forward-looking note. In your book, you give several examples of countries where the military has been heavily entwined in the economy and then has walked back from that involvement. How did that take place? Where did that take place? How did that take place? And do those examples have any lessons for Pakistan?
Sure, Bob. I think the best example that I can think of is China. Our great friend, Pakistan's great friend, China. In 1998, Chinese military, the PLA, was ordered by the Communist Party and by the government to disinvest from the service industry entirely. This was done because they wanted a professional force. They had to, of course, build a strong military which could counter the United States. But they also figured out that a military which got involved in multiple roles could not then deliver on professional grounds. And therefore, it had to be pushed back. But Bob, let me quickly give you one other example where the military is coming into the economy and how dangerous it is for the political and social relationships of the state. And I'm here referring to the developing economic role of the Pasdaran in Iran. The paramilitary force is there, and again, like in our own case, the Iranian paramilitary paramilitary force are connected. Their economic activities are there to feed the bunyads or the charities, and the charities are controlled by Hashmi. Rafsanjani had direct linkage with the bunyads. Now, part of the problem is that these Khatamul Anbiya, that's one of the welfare organizations of the Pasdaran, it now has deep stakes, extensive stakes in oil and gas and construction. And as this economic role expands, so does the influence and visibility of the Pasdaran. Now, what I'm suggesting by giving this example is that on the one hand, you have China, where in order to professionalize, the military had to be cleaned off or relatively cleaned of all the roles. And here you have cases like Iran, like other countries, where the military is getting deeply entrenched in other things, which will not only affect their professional character, but it will also affect the manner in which they influence the society and the economy at large. For example, the Pasdaran are not expected to pay any taxes. There is Article 44, it's Article 44 of the Iranian Constitution, which has promoted privatization. But interestingly, their privatization keeps out the military. There is no transparency and accountability. The Supervisory Council, which has been set up according to this new policy of privatization, the Supervisory Council is being headed by an army general. It will further create problems of corruption, it will create problems of transparency. It's going to create stakes then, which will threaten, the overall political character, the nature of socio-economics and socio-politics in Iran. And my submission is that wherever that happens, wherever in the world you allow this military capital to grow and connect with the political strength of that organization, you're not going to have healthy results.
I'm afraid we have to conclude, though I see lots of hands still up. Thank you for joining us. Join me in a round of applause for our speaker, please. Buy yourself a copy of the book. It's an important book. It's a detailed book. It's a very rich analysis. Whether you agree or disagree, you'll certainly learn a lot. Thanks for coming today.
Ayesha Siddiqa is a military analyst for Jane's Defense Weekly. She's also author of Pakistan's Arms Procurement and Military Buildup. This event was held at the Wilson Center. Find out more at wilsoncenter.org.